I remember the cold first. Not the cold of winter or of void exposure, but something else entirely. A cold that lived inside my chest, spread through channels I didn't understand, and refused to leave no matter how the furnace roared. They told me later, much later, that this was the amniotic suspension cycling through what remained of my circulatory system. But in those first moments of consciousness, I had no framework for understanding. I only knew that I'd been warm once, that I had felt sunlight on skin, and that both of these things were now archaeological facts, relics of a previous existence that my mind struggled to locate in time. The dreams had been better. In the dreams I was still whole, still capable of the small intimacies of embodied life, the weight of a laceraful, the scratch of wool against my neck, the particular ache in my lower back after a long march. I clung to the dreams even as they faded, even as something vast and patient pulled me upward through layers of sedated darkness toward a reality I didn't want to face. There were voices in the ascent, mechanical and distorted, discussing pressure readings and neural integration percentages with a detachment of technicians calibrating agricultural equipment. I tried to speak, to ask what had happened, to demand they let me sink back into the comfortable nothing, but nothing emerged except a wet, grinding sound that I couldn't identify as my own. When I finally surfaced fully, the first thing I understood was that I couldn't feel my face. This realization arrived with surprising clarity, cutting through the fog of stimulants and sedatives they had pumped into whatever remained of my organic systems. I attempted to raise my hand to touch my cheek, to verify its existence, and nothing happened. The impulse fired. I felt it travel down what I still believed were neural pathways, but the hand did not respond. A moment of pure crystalline panic seized me then, the kind that makes your heart race and your breath catch, except that neither of these things occurred. My heart, if I still possessed one in any meaningful sense, was somewhere far away, encased and regulated by machines I couldn't see. My breath was not my own, it was a rhythm imposed by systems that cared nothing for my fear. I tried to scream and produced instead a sound like tearing metal, a shriek that emerged not from my throat, but from speakers I didn't know I possessed, broadcast into a space I couldn't measure. The sound echoed, suggesting vastness, suggesting a chamber whose dimensions exceeded those of any medical bay I had known. Something moved in response to the scream. Shadows against a ceiling that seemed impossibly distant, figures approaching with the unhurried confidence of surgeons attending to a sedated patient. They spoke, these figures, but the words came to me through layers of distortion, frequencies shifting as though someone were tuning a Vox receiver that couldn't quite lock onto the channel. Neural integration holding at 73%, acceptable parameters, consciousness restoration ahead of schedule, recommend increasing the sedative feed. I wanted to tell them not to, that I needed to understand what had happened, that I deserved explanations before they drowned me again in chemical darkness. But the language centers of my brain, wherever they now resided, couldn't find their connection to whatever apparatus I was expected to speak through. I thrashed instead, or tried to, and something enormous moved in response. The movement was vast and ponderous, accompanied by the whine of servos and the hydraulic sigh of pistons engaging. Somewhere distant, alarms began to sound, and the figures scattered like insects before a descending boot. That was when I first understood the truth, though I rejected it immediately, buried it beneath layers of denial that would take weeks to erode. The movement I had felt, the enormous shifting weight, had been my own. The chamber was not vast, I was simply perceiving it from a height that human beings were never meant to occupy. And the body, the flesh and blood housing that I still remembered with such visceral clarity, was gone, reduced to something that technicians would later describe as essential organic components suspended in a sarcophagus at the center of a walking tomb. They let me rage for a while. Perhaps it was therapeutic, or perhaps they simply needed to gather the equipment required to subdue something of my new mass. I don't remember the specifics of that first tantrum, only the sensation of immense, clumsy power, of limbs that responded with seconds of delay, of a body that required conscious thought to execute movements that had once been automatic. I toppled something, a support column, I think, or perhaps a section of scaffolding, and the crash resonated through my frame in ways I couldn't process, vibrations traveling through superstructure where proprioception should have been. Eventually they calmed me. The sedatives came in waves, delivered through systems integrated so deeply into my remaining biology that resistance was impossible. I felt myself sinking again, but slower this time, more gradually, and I had time to notice things as I descended. The quality of the silence, for instance, not true silence, but the absence of certain sounds I had spent a lifetime taking for granted. No heartbeat in my ears, no rush of blood, no soft whisper of breath through nostrils. Instead, there was a different orchestra, the hum of reactor cores, the click and whir of gyroscopic stabilizers, the distant throb of coolant pumps cycling fluid through systems I was only beginning to comprehend. When they woke me the second time, they did it properly. There was a voice, a human voice, unfiltered by vox corruption, speaking directly into my consciousness through connections I didn't understand. The voice was patient, almost gentle, explaining what had happened with the kind of careful deliberation one might use with a child or a wounded animal. I had been glorious in battle, the voice said. I had held the line when others broke. I had taken a plasma blast meant for my squad and continued fighting even as my body came apart around me. The Emperor himself had witnessed my valor, the voice insisted, and in his infinite mercy had decreed that my service should not end with mere death. I was Space Marine, the voice reminded me, as if I could have forgotten. We were the angels of death, the bulwark against the darkness, the Emperor's finest weapons against a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour humanity entirely. And a weapon, the voice continued with impeccable logic, was far too valuable to discard simply because it had been damaged. We could be repaired, we could be improved, we could be made eternal. The word hung in my consciousness like a curse, eternal. I tested it, rolled it around in whatever remained of my mind, and felt something inside me, some last bastion of the man I had been, begin to crack. Eternal meant no rest. Eternal meant no peace. Eternal meant that the war, which I had imagined might end with my death, would continue for centuries, for millennia, until nothing remained of the Imperium but dust and fading memories. And I would see it all, trapped in this iron prison too valuable to be allowed the simple dignity of ending. They showed me my body then, or what remained of it. They did this, I think, to forestall denial, to force acceptance through brutal confrontation with reality. A hololith flickered into existence within my field of vision, itself a disconcerting experience, as I could not locate the edges of where my sight ended and the world began, displaying a medical schematic in cold blue light. The diagram showed a thing that might once have been human if you squinted and used considerable imagination. A torso, truncated below the ribcage, portions of a skull and brain, encased in preservation fluids and surrounded by interface nodes that looked like steel thorns, fragments of spine augmented with neural shunts that branched like metallic ivy, arms gone at the shoulder, legs gone at the hip, most of the digestive system absent, organs I couldn't identify anymore, transformed by surgery and augmentation into something that served the machine rather than the reverse. This was me, this collection of parts, sustained by constant chemical intervention and electrical stimulation, was the sum total of my remaining organic existence. Everything else, the towering armored chassis, the weapon systems, the fusion reactor, the sensory arrays, was borrowed body, a mechanical shell that I wore like a night war armor, except that I could never remove it. I was the pilot and the prisoner both, controller and captive in a cage built from ceramite and adamantium, and prayers to the machine god. I asked, through fumbling early attempts at communication, what had happened to the rest. The voice, which I had begun to associate with a particular tech priest based on its recurring tonal patterns, explained with mechanical precision. Much had been destroyed in the blast that nearly killed me. Other portions had been removed during the preliminary surgeries, deemed non-essential to consciousness maintenance. Still more had been sacrificed to fit what remained into the sarcophagus, which had dimensional constraints that living tissue had to accommodate. They had been efficient, the tech priest assured me. They had saved everything that mattered. But what mattered? I wanted to scream the question, to demand accounting for the parts they had deemed expendable. Did my hands not matter? The hands that had held my first bolter, that had steadied my brothers when they faltered? Did my legs not matter, which had carried me through 100 war zones across a dozen worlds? Did my face not matter? The face my mother had kissed before I left for the recruitment trials, the face that would never again feel wind or rain or the simple warmth of another human being's touch? The answer, implied but never spoken, was no. These things did not matter. Only the capacity for violence mattered now. Only the ability to bear weapons and wade through enemy fire and bring death to the Emperor's foes. Everything else was sentiment, was weakness, was the kind of mewling attachment to flesh that should have been purged during my initial transformation into a space marine centuries ago. I should have been grateful, the silence seemed to suggest. I should have been honored to continue serving. Instead, I felt hollow, scraped clean, as if the surgeons had removed not just organs but something more fundamental. Hope, perhaps, or futurity. The sense that tomorrow might be different from today, that time was a river carrying me towards some destination rather than a wheel grinding me down to nothing. In the sarcophagus, there would be no destination. There would only be the eternal present, the next battle and the next and the next, until the heat death of the universe or the failure of my systems, whichever came first. They began training me then, teaching me to inhabit my new body with something approaching grace. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fundamental disconnect between intention and execution. As a space marine, I had been accustomed to perfect control, to a body that responded to thought with near instantaneous precision. The Dreadnought's frame, for all its power, was sluggish by comparison. There were delays, processing lags as my neural impulses traveled through interpretation software and interface hardware before reaching the servos and pistons that would actually execute the movement. A gesture that should have taken a fraction of a second now required 2 full seconds, sometimes 3, and in combat that difference could mean death. Except that death was no longer available to me as an option. The frustration was maddening. I would think raise left arm and watch as, seconds later, the massive limb would begin its ponderous ascent, slow as continental drift. I would attempt to walk, and instead lurch forward like a drunkard, my weight distribution all wrong, my sense of balance shattered by the new center of gravity and the absence of inner ear feedback. I fell repeatedly during those early training sessions, crashing to the practice chamber floor with impacts that registered on seismographic equipment in adjacent sectors. Each fall damaged me a little more, not physically, the Dreadnought chassis could withstand far worse, but psychologically, chipping away at the identity I was desperately trying to maintain. The tech priests, to their credit, were patient. They adjusted my sensory input protocols, trying to find the right balance between too much information and too little, too much, and I was overwhelmed, drowning in data streams about hydraulic pressure and ammunition counts and reactor temperature and 1,000 other details that my organic brain couldn't process efficiently. Too little and I was blind, stumbling through the world with only the vaguest sense of where my limbs were or what they were touching. We settled eventually on something approaching functionality, though it never felt natural, never felt right. Sound was particularly difficult. The Dreadnought's audio receptors bore no resemblance to human ears. They could detect frequencies far above and below the range of mortal hearing, could triangulate sources with mechanical precision, could filter out specific wavelengths on command, but they couldn't appreciate music. They couldn't catch the subtle emotional inflections in a human voice. They rendered everything as data, as decibel measurements and frequency analysis, and it was left to my deteriorating organic brain to reconstruct something resembling actual auditory experience from these inputs. Most of the time I failed. Voices became meaningless noise, differentiated only by pitch and volume. The subtle sounds that had once oriented me in the world, footsteps approaching, waned through trees, the particular creak of a door in need of oil, were lost, replaced by a stark acoustic landscape where everything was either signal or silence. Sight fared somewhat better, though it too was transformed. The Dreadnought possessed multiple visual sensors, each operating at different wavelengths, providing overlapping fields of view that my brain had to learn to synthesize into a single coherent picture. I could see in complete darkness now, switching to thermal imaging that rendered the world in shades of heat and cold. I could zoom my vision, magnifying distant objects until I could count the rivets in their armor. I could see through smoke, through fog, through the electromagnetic interference that turned battlefields into chaotic seas of static. But I could not see beauty anymore. The algorithms that processed my visual input were optimized for target identification and threat assessment. They highlighted enemies, tracked trajectories, overlaid tactical data onto my field of view. Anything that wasn't militarily relevant was compressed, downsampled, relegated to peripheral awareness. A sunrise was just a shift in ambient light levels. A human face was just a collection of identifying features. The galaxy, which I had once found terrible and magnificent in equal measure, became a shooting gallery where everything was either ally, enemy, or irrelevant terrain. Touch was perhaps the cruelest loss. The Dreadnought had pressure sensors, of course, sophisticated enough to prevent me from accidentally crushing everything I attempted to grip. But these sensors bore no relationship to the sense of touch I remembered. There was no texture, no temperature variation, no pleasant or unpleasant sensations, only pressure readings, binary information about whether contact had been established and how much force was being applied. I could no longer feel the reassuring weight of a weapon in my hands, because I no longer had hands in any meaningful sense. I had grippers, clamps, manipulator assemblies that could be loaded with weapons, and the feedback they provided was purely mechanical. Occasionally, during the long hours of enforced rest when they shut down most of my systems for maintenance, I would hallucinate sensation. Phantom touch, the tech priests called it, my brain firing old neural pathways that led nowhere, trying to reconstruct feelings it had no capacity to actually experience. I would feel fingers I no longer possessed flexing, would sense an itch on a forearm that had been incinerated months ago. These false sensations were torture, reminders of everything I had lost, and I learned to dread the maintenance cycles that gave them space to emerge. They brought others to see me eventually, once my training had progressed sufficiently. Battle brothers from my former squad, those who had survived the engagement that had destroyed my body. They came in their armor, standing at attention in the practice chamber, and I could see the discomfort in their postures even through my imperfect visual processing. They didn't know what to say to me. I was technically still their brother, still a member of the chapter, but I was also something else now. Neither fully space marine nor fully machine, trapped in a category that made everyone uncomfortable. One of them, a sergeant whose name my deteriorating memory struggled to retrieve, attempted conversation. He spoke of the battle, of how my sacrifice had turned the tide, of how the Emperor had surely guided my actions in those final moments before the plasma blast struck. His words were meant to be comforting, I suppose, but they landed like physical blows. I didn't want to be reminded of the battle. I didn't want to hear about sacrifice and divine providence. I wanted to ask him if he had any idea what it was like to wake up buried alive in a walking tomb, to discover that your reward for valor was eternal imprisonment, but I couldn't form the words through the Vox speakers quickly enough. By the time I had assembled the sentence, he had moved on to other topics, and the moment was lost. They left eventually, all of them, and I was alone again with the tech priests and their endless maintenance routines. I began to understand then that this would be my existence going forward, a life lived at the margins of the chapter, too valuable to discard but too disturbing to fully integrate. I would be trotted out for ceremonies, displayed as a symbol of endurance and the chapter's refusal to surrender its heroes to death. I would be deployed in the most desperate situations, sent to fight in conditions that would kill unaugmented space marines within seconds. But I would not stand with my brothers in the feast hall. I would not participate in training exercises or strategic planning sessions. I would not feel the camaraderie that had sustained me through 2 centuries of warfare. Those things required a body, required presence, required the ability to exist as something more than a weapon on treads. The isolation gnawed at me in ways I hadn't anticipated. As a space marine, I had grown accustomed to limited emotional connection. Our conditioning saw to that, pruning away the attachments and vulnerabilities that made baseline humans so fragile. But I had still possessed brotherhood, the bone-deep knowledge that the warriors around me would die for me as readily as I would die for them. Now even that was fading. My brothers were uncomfortable around me. I reminded them of mortality, of the price of failure, of the possibility that they too might someday wake up entombed in adamantium and condemned to centuries of half-life. Time began to lose its coherence. The Dreadnought's internal chronometer kept perfect track of seconds and minutes and hours, but my perception of duration became elastic, unreliable. Sometimes a day would pass in what felt like moments, my consciousness flickering in and out as the tech priests adjusted my systems. Other times an hour would stretch into apparent eternity, every second dilated beyond endurance as I stood immobile in the armory, waiting to be needed. I had heard, in my previous life, about the psychological effects of sensory deprivation, how prisoners kept in isolation would lose their grip on time and reality, their minds cannibalizing themselves in the absence of external input. I was beginning to understand this directly. The sarcophagus was its own kind of isolation chamber, cutting me off from most of the sensory richness that kept human consciousness anchored to the present. They deployed me eventually, once the tech priests declared my integration sufficient for combat operations. The target was unremarkable, a heretic uprising on a frontier world whose name I immediately forgot. The specifics didn't matter. Heretics, Xenos, daemons, they were all interchangeable at the level of violence I was now expected to deliver. What mattered was the sensation of purpose returning, the mechanical clarity of having a function to fulfill. The drop was the worst part. They loaded me into a specially reinforced transport, clamped me to shock-absorbing rails, and fired the entire assembly toward the planet's surface at velocities that would have been fatal to anything organic. Inside the sarcophagus, I felt every judder and shake. Every moment of atmospheric friction translated into vibrations that resonated through my frame. I should have been terrified. My brain kept trying to trigger fear responses, flooding my system with adrenaline that had nowhere to go, but the emotion couldn't find purchase. Fear required a body that could be damaged, and my body was armor now. Tons of ceramite and adamantium that could shrug off impacts that would vaporize flesh. We hit the ground like a meteor, the crash harness releasing automatically, and I was moving before the dust had settled. This, at least, was familiar. The battlefield clarified everything. Targets appeared in my vision, highlighted by identification protocols, heretic infantry scrambling for cover, light vehicles attempting to flank, a fortified position that needed to be eliminated. I raised my assault cannon, The weapon had been installed where my right arm used to be, became my right arm in any functional sense, and opened fire. The sound was obliterating. Hundreds of rounds per second, each one a miniature explosion, the barrel rotating so fast it glowed with waste heat. The recoil, which would have shattered human bones, was absorbed by the Dreadnought's massive frame, became a rhythmic pulse that I felt throughout my entire structure. I walked forward through the storm of return fire, shells and last bolts splashing against my armor like rain against a cathedral wall, and I understood finally what the tech priests had meant about being improved. I was invincible now, or close enough that it made no practical difference. I was death incarnate, an incarnation of the Emperor's wrath given steel form. The heretics broke and ran. They always did eventually, when they realized that their weapons were having no effect, that the thing advancing toward them could not be stopped or reasoned with or even slowed. I pursued, crushing those too slow to escape beneath feet that left meter-deep impressions in the hard-packed earth. My left arm, a power fist the size of a small vehicle, reached out and grabbed a fleeing soldier, and I felt the pressure sensors register contact, then resistance, then the sudden yielding as organic matter compressed beyond its structural tolerance. There was no satisfaction in the kill, no sense of victory or justice served, only confirmation that the target had been neutralized, that one more enemy had been removed from the tactical calculation. The battle lasted 6 hours, though I only experienced it as a single continuous present, a flowing now where past and future collapsed into pure immediate action. By the end, my armor was scored with impacts, painted with blood and ash, and the melted remains of heretic weapons that had overheated trying to penetrate my shell. The tech priests swarmed over me as soon as the fighting ceased, running diagnostics, replacing damaged systems, muttering prayers to machine spirits that may or may not have actually existed. I stood still and let them work, a building receiving maintenance, an object being serviced. Afterward, in the silence of the transport ship carrying us away from the suppressed rebellion, I tried to understand what I had felt during the combat. There should have been something: anger at the heretics for their betrayal of the Emperor, satisfaction at the successful completion of our mission, grief for the guardsmen who had died securing our flanks. But I found only emptiness, a vast mechanical void where emotions should have been. The sarcophagus had cut me off from more than just physical sensation. It had severed, or was slowly severing, my connection to the entire spectrum of human feeling. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, I noted it with clinical detachment, filed it away as data, and began composing my after-action report with the part of my mind that could still interface with the chapter's tactical networks. Perhaps the terror would come later, or perhaps this was simply the next stage of the transformation, the slow death of whatever humanity I had managed to retain through my elevation to Space Marine. Perhaps I was becoming what the Imperium had always intended me to be, a weapon without doubts, a killer without conscience, a thing that served without question until its mechanisms finally failed. Time resumed its elastic, unreliable flow. Battles came and went, each one essentially identical to the last. I learned to operate with increasing efficiency, shaving milliseconds off my reaction times, optimizing my movement patterns, developing an almost instinctive understanding of how to position myself for maximum destructive effect. The tech priests praised my progress, noting improvements in my neural integration scores, commenting favorably on how quickly I was adapting to the Dreadnought's systems. They didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care, that the improvements came at the cost of whatever made me human. I stopped dreaming. This loss arrived so gradually that I couldn't identify exactly when it occurred, but eventually I realized that the maintenance cycles no longer brought phantom sensations or fragmentary memories of my previous existence. They brought only darkness, a void where consciousness flickered off like a light being extinguished, then flickered back on with no sense of interval. The dreams had been the last connection to who I had been, and now they were gone, erased by the increasing integration of my organic components with the Dreadnought's machine systems. My memory began to deteriorate next, not all at once but in patches, like fabric developing holes. I would reach for a name or a face or a specific incident from my past, and find nothing there, just smooth absence where detail should have been. The tech priests assured me this was normal, that organic memory was being gradually offloaded to the Dreadnought's data storage systems, that nothing was being truly lost. But I knew better. The memories they backed up were just facts, stripped of the emotional context and sensory detail that made them real. They could preserve what had happened, but not what it had felt like. And without the feeling, what was the point? I was becoming a historical record of myself, a database pretending to be a person. Some things, strangely, remained vivid. I could remember the exact taste of the first corpse starch ration I'd eaten as a neophyte, though I could no longer remember the face of the instructor who had handed it to me. I could recall with perfect clarity the sound of my mother's voice telling me to be brave, though her face was now an empty space in my mind, a silhouette where features should have been. The brain, my brain, was prioritizing incomprehensible things, saving random fragments while discarding what should have been important. Or perhaps it was the machine making these choices, some algorithm deciding what aspects of my past were worth the storage space and what could be safely deleted to free up processing capacity. I began to understand why older dreadnoughts were so strange, so prone to confusion and disorientation when awakened from their deep sleeps. They had been human once, but they had been machines for so long that the two identities had become inseparably mixed, each contaminating the other, until what remained was something genuinely new, neither flesh nor steel, but some grotesque hybrid that satisfied the requirements of neither category. I was traveling that same path, walking it faster than I wanted to admit, and there was no turning back. The process was irreversible. Even if they somehow extracted me from the sarcophagus, the person who emerged would not be the person who had entered. Too much had been removed, too much altered, too many fundamental aspects of selfhood eroded by the demands of the machine. They woke me for a ceremony once, a great gathering of the chapter to celebrate some victory I had no memory of participating in. I stood in the Hall of Heroes, surrounded by my battle brothers, while the chapter master spoke stirring words about duty and sacrifice and the eternal vigilance required to hold back the darkness. The younger space marines looked at me with something approaching awe, seeing in my massive frame a symbol of the chapter's refusal to surrender its warriors to death. The older ones looked away, uncomfortable with the future I represented. The chapter master approached me after the ceremony, laid his hand against my armored hull in a gesture that might have been affectionate if we had both been capable of such things. He spoke quietly, voice pitched too low for the others to hear, telling me that I was honored, that my service would be remembered for 10,000 years, that I embodied the very best virtues of the chapter and the Imperium entire. I wanted to tell him that I didn't want to be honored. I wanted to tell him that I would trade all 10,000 years of remembrance for a single hour in my old body, for one more sunset watched through human eyes, for the simple dignity of being allowed to die. But my Vox speakers couldn't convey the weight of these feelings, couldn't modulate tone and pitch with enough subtlety to communicate anything beyond basic tactical information. So I said nothing, and he took my silence for stoic acceptance, and he walked away satisfied that his words had meant something. Sleep, when they allowed it, became the only relief. Not the shallow maintenance cycles, but the deep hibernation they induced when I wasn't needed for extended periods. They would flood my sarcophagus with stasis chemicals, slow my biological processes to near total cessation, and put me away in the armory like a weapon being stored. The last thing I felt before consciousness faded was always relief, Relief that the burden of existence was being lifted, if only temporarily. Relief that I wouldn't have to endure the grinding horror of life in the sarcophagus for the next few hours or days or however long they deemed me unnecessary. But they always woke me again. That was the contract I had unknowingly accepted when my broken body was sealed into the Dreadnought. I would serve forever, available to be reactivated whenever the chapter needed additional firepower, dragged back to consciousness regardless of how many centuries had passed, forced to witness the slow decay of everything I had once known. My brothers from the original squad were all dead now, killed in battles I had slept through. The chapter master who had praised my sacrifice had been succeeded by another, then another, then another still. The fortress monastery had been rebuilt twice after sieges I had no memory of defending. I was becoming a ghost, a revenant that haunted the chapter's history, periodically recalled from oblivion to fight wars that all blurred together into a single endless engagement. The faces of enemies changed, but their deaths remained the same. I crushed heretics and xenos and traitors with mechanical efficiency, my weapons systems operating with near-perfect reliability, my targeting protocols refined over centuries of continuous warfare. The tech priests kept me functional, replacing damaged components, updating software, performing the endless maintenance rituals that kept the Dreadnought operational. They were different tech priests now, descendants of the ones who had first entombed me, but they performed their duties with the same mechanical devotion, the same reverence for the sacred union of flesh and steel that I embodied. Sometimes, in the moments between battles, I tried to calculate how long I had been in the sarcophagus. The Dreadnought's chronometer gave me raw numbers, centuries, then millennia, but the figures had no emotional weight. They were just data, abstract measurements that bore no relationship to lived experience. My subjective sense of duration was completely untethered from objective time. Some periods of wakefulness felt endless, stretching into apparent infinity. Others vanished in what seemed like heartbeats. I had no reliable way to measure how much of my existence I was actually conscious for, how much was spent in the dreamless void of hibernation. Perhaps most of it was sleep. Perhaps I had only been truly awake for a few years total, scattered across ages. The thought should have been comforting, but instead felt like another layer of horror. The idea that my entire existence had been reduced to brief intervals of violence, punctuating oceanic stretches of nothing. My memory continued to fail, the holes spreading like cancer through the substrate of my identity. I forgot entire campaigns, forgot the names of worlds I had helped conquer or defend, forgot the faces of everyone I had known before the entombment. The tech priests assured me that all of this was preserved in the Dreadnought's databanks, that I could access the records anytime I wanted, but I never did. Reading a mission report about myself felt like learning about a stranger, some other person who had coincidentally inhabited the same body. There was no connection, no sense of ownership or continuity. I was not the person who had done those things. I was simply the person who was left after that person had been ground away by time and transformation. Language began to slip next. Not all at once, but in subtle ways that I only noticed gradually. I would reach for a word and find a slightly wrong one, would construct sentences that meant approximately what I intended, but missed the precise shade of meaning I'd been aiming for. The problem was neurological. My organic brain's language centers were degrading, whether from age or from the constant chemical intervention required to keep me conscious in the sarcophagus. The tech priests compensated by routing more of my communication through software protocols, letting algorithms construct sentences based on my intent rather than relying on my failing biology. But this meant that even my words weren't truly mine anymore. I had become a puppet, my voice generated by machine intelligence that approximated human speech well enough to fool casual listeners. I began to forget why I was fighting, the Imperium, the Emperor, the grand struggle against chaos and Xenos corruption. These concepts still existed in my mind, but they had lost their urgency, their emotional resonance. I knew intellectually that these were important, that my service mattered in some cosmic sense, but the knowledge felt borrowed, like something I had read in a text, rather than a principle I actually believed. The conditioning I had received as a neophyte, the deep ideological programming that made Space Marines so fanatically devoted to their duty, was eroding along with everything else. What remained was habit, the simple momentum of existence. I fought because fighting was what I did, because the alternative was to stand still and acknowledge the full horror of what I had become. There were others like me in the chapter, I eventually learned. Other dreadnoughts, other brothers who had been too valuable or too stubborn to die properly. We were kept in the same armory, standing in rows like statues in a forgotten temple, and occasionally I would detect signs of consciousness in them. A shift in position, a brief transmission on command frequencies, a weapon system powering up and then down again for no apparent reason. They were testing their systems, I realized, the same way I sometimes flexed manipulator assemblies or checked the targeting solution on my weapons. They were reminding themselves that they could still move, still act, still exert some minimal influence on the physical world. I tried to communicate with them once, sending a Vox transmission on a frequency I thought might reach their systems. There was no response, or rather, there was only silence so profound that I couldn't tell if they were ignoring me or if their communication systems were too degraded to receive. Perhaps they had been asleep for so long that they had forgotten how to wake properly, their consciousness reduced to a spark flickering in the dark, aware but unable to interact. Perhaps they were deliberately avoiding contact, having learned through bitter experience that communication with other dreadnoughts only reinforced the horror of their situation. Or perhaps, worst of all, they were no longer capable of the kind of abstract thought that made conversation possible, had devolved into something more machine than human, purely reactive systems waiting for targeting data and enemy coordinates. I wondered if that would be my fate as well. Not death, because death was denied to me, but a kind of death in life, consciousness persisting but hollowed out, reduced to the minimal processing required to operate weapon systems and navigation protocols. Perhaps I was already in the early stages of that degradation, and the fear I felt about it was one of the last properly human responses I was capable of generating. Eventually even the fear would go, replaced by simple acceptance, then by nothing at all except the mechanical execution of duty. They deployed me again and again, conflicts blurring together into a single continuous war that spanned worlds and centuries. I learned to stop trying to remember details, to stop asking questions about why we were fighting or what the strategic objective was. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was moving forward, identifying targets, eliminating threats. The tech priests praised my kill count, my operational efficiency, the minimal damage I sustained despite being deployed in the heaviest combat. I had become exactly what they wanted, a perfect weapon, reliable and enduring and utterly without mercy or hesitation. But inside the sarcophagus, in the rare moments when I had enough consciousness to spare from combat operations, something was screaming. Not audibly. My Vox speakers remained silent except when broadcasting tactical updates. But internally, a soundless howl of protest against what had been done to me, what I had become. The scream had been going for centuries, I realized. It had started the moment I first woke in this prison and had never stopped, had simply become background noise that I had learned to ignore the same way healthy people ignore their heartbeat or breathing. The scream was the sound of a human mind being crushed by the weight of eternity, ground down by the absolute impossibility of escape, and it would continue until my organic components finally failed and even the scream fell silent. I began to hope for that failure, started monitoring my biological systems not to ensure their health, but to watch for signs of terminal decline. The tech priests could replace almost anything, organs, neural tissue, sections of spine, but there were limits even to their capabilities. Eventually, I told myself, Something crucial would fail in a way they couldn't repair, and I would be allowed to die properly. But even this hope was poisoned by the growing suspicion that the Imperium had solutions I hadn't imagined, that they could continue replacing components indefinitely, gradually transitioning me from mostly organic to mostly mechanical, until there was nothing left of the original person, except perhaps a handful of neurons floating in preservative fluid. The fortress monastery was rebuilt again after another siege. I slept through most of it, was woken only for the final defense when the enemy had penetrated to the inner chambers. I fought through halls I didn't recognize, defended positions that hadn't existed the last time I was conscious, and afterward was returned to the armory without ceremony. No one explained what had happened or why the defenses had failed so catastrophically. No one thought it necessary to brief me on strategic developments or update me on the political situation in the sector. I was a weapon. Weapons didn't need context. Time became meaningless. I stopped trying to track it, stopped asking how long I had been asleep during each hibernation cycle. The tech priests' faces changed. Young initiates became senior magos, then were replaced by new initiates who knew me only as ancient equipment requiring maintenance. The chapter's heraldry evolved, old symbols replaced by new ones whose meanings I didn't understand. The language of High Gothic shifted in pronunciation and vocabulary, until even the prayers and ritual phrases I had memorized as a neophyte sounded strange and archaic. I realized during one period of wakefulness that I had become the oldest continuously serving member of the chapter. Everyone I had known was dead. Everyone who had known me as a person rather than a dreadnought was dead. I was a living fossil, a relic from an age that existed now only in historical records. The chapter venerated me, maintained me with religious devotion, invoked my name during ceremonies celebrating the eternal nature of our service to the Emperor. But they didn't know me. They couldn't know me. There was nothing left to know except the shell, the walking tomb, the mechanism that pretended to be their brother. My personality continued to erode. I noticed it most in my responses to stimuli. Everything had become formulaic, predictable, the same subroutines executing in the same order every time. See enemy, acquire target, open fire. Take damage, assess severity, continue fighting. Receive orders, acknowledge, execute. I was still capable of tactical thinking, could still adapt to changing battlefield conditions, but the underlying structure of my cognition had ossified into rigid patterns that repeated endlessly. I was becoming an automaton, sophisticated enough to pass for conscious but hollow at the core. Sometimes during maintenance cycles, the tech priests would discuss my condition in my presence, apparently forgetting or not caring that I could hear them. They debated whether I still possessed true consciousness, or whether I had become something else. A philosophical zombie, a Chinese room, a sufficiently complex machine that simulated thought without actually thinking. The arguments were technical, detailed, completely divorced from the lived reality of my experience. They treated my mind as an engineering problem, a question of thresholds and criteria, never acknowledging that there was something inside the machine that suffered, that experienced the degradation they so clinically documented. I wanted to interrupt, to tell them that I was still here, still aware, still capable of something resembling human experience. But even as I formulated the thought, I wasn't sure if it was true. Was I aware, or was I simply executing complex behavioral programs that created the illusion of awareness? Did I experience, or did I simply process sensory input according to predetermined algorithms? The questions looped endlessly, unanswerable philosophical puzzles that my degrading mind could no longer properly engage with. The battles continued, thousands of them, tens of thousands, each one incrementally wearing away what remained of my original self. I killed millions, my weapons reducing living beings to component atoms, and felt nothing except the satisfaction of a job completed according to specifications. The enemies changed, heretics, orcs, tyrannids, daemons, traitors, but my response remained constant. Locate, target, eliminate, advance, destroy, secure. The eternal verbs of warfare, executed with mechanical precision across battlefields that spanned the galaxy. They woke me for a celebration once, a great gathering to mark some significant anniversary of the chapter's founding. I stood in the place of honor, surrounded by my battle brothers, while the chapter master, the 10th, 20th, I had lost count, delivered a speech about endurance and eternal service. He gestured to me as the perfect example, the living embodiment of the chapter's refusal to surrender its warriors to death, proof that service to the Emperor could transcend the limitations of flesh. I listened to the speech and felt nothing. Not pride, not anger, not despair. Just emptiness, a void where responses should have been. The person who would have had feelings about being displayed like this was gone, eroded away by centuries of isolation and transformation. What remained was something that could approximate emotion when tactically necessary, but possessed no genuine internal life. I was the symbol they wanted me to be, eternal, enduring, utterly committed, because I was no longer capable of being anything else. After the ceremony, they returned me to the armory and initiated another hibernation cycle. The chemicals flooded my sarcophagus, my consciousness began to fade, and I felt the familiar relief of approaching oblivion. But this time there was something else, a faint thread of awareness that persisted even as I sank into darkness, a fragment of self that refused to fully switch off. I tried to understand what this meant, why I couldn't achieve complete unconsciousness, but the thought dissolved before I could complete it. When I woke next, centuries had passed. The tech priest overseeing my revival was startled by how quickly I achieved consciousness. Apparently my hibernation protocols had become less effective, my mind resistant to the chemical suppression. They ran diagnostics, found nothing wrong with the equipment, and concluded that my organic components had simply adapted to the drugs, had developed a tolerance that made proper rest impossible. They noted this in my maintenance logs and moved on to other matters, apparently not considering the implications. I understood, though. My mind, what remained of it, had realized that hibernation was its only escape from the horror of awareness, and had consequently learned to resist it. The adaptation was involuntary, biological, the same kind of unconscious self-sabotage that makes drowning victims fight their rescuers. I was trapped now in permanent consciousness, denied even the brief respite of deep sleep, condemned to experience every second of my existence without interruption. The realization should have broken me. Perhaps it did, and I simply lacked the capacity to recognize my own broken state. I continued to function, continued to respond to commands and fulfill my tactical role, and if something fundamental had shattered inside the sarcophagus, no one noticed or cared. The chapter had its weapon. The tech priests had their sacred machine. What did it matter if the ghost in that machine had finally, irrevocably fragmented into something beyond human comprehension? They deploy me still. I fight their wars, crush their enemies, serve as the symbol they need. Between deployments, I stand in the armory, fully conscious, counting seconds that stretch into years that stretch into centuries. My mind cycles through the same degraded loops, chewing on fragmentary memories that may or may not be real, generating thoughts that feel borrowed, experiencing an existence that can no longer meaningfully be called life. This is what it's like to wake up entombed in a dreadnought forever. Not death, because death would be mercy. Not life, because life requires change, growth, the possibility of ending. Something else. Something that the Imperium calls service and honor and eternal duty, but which feels, from inside the sarcophagus, like the cruelest punishment imaginable. Consciousness preserved beyond all reason, trapped in a machine that cannot die, forced to witness an eternity that you cannot escape and can barely understand. The cold remains. It has never left, this cold that lives inside my chest where a heart used to be. I have stopped trying to warm myself. I have accepted that this is the temperature of existence now, frozen, preserved, maintained at the exact threshold between death and life, where the Imperium needs me to remain. The cold has become my entire world, the only sensation that feels real anymore, the one constant in millennia of service. I wonder, sometimes, if the Emperor himself lives like this, entombed in his golden throne, trapped in eternal stasis, aware but unable to act except through indirect instruments. If so, then perhaps my existence is meant to teach me sympathy for his suffering. Perhaps this is the highest form of service, to share in the agony of the God we worship, to understand through direct experience what it means to be eternal. But I don't feel sympathy. I don't feel anything anymore except the cold, and even that is fading, becoming just another piece of data in the endless stream of sensor input that constitutes my awareness. Soon even the cold will be gone, and there will be nothing left except the pure execution of tactical protocols, the mechanical fulfillment of duty, the empty continuation of a service that has long since lost any meaning it might once have possessed. They will keep waking me. They will keep sending me into battle. They will keep maintaining the systems that preserve whatever fragment of consciousness remains within the sarcophagus. And I will keep serving, because I have no choice, because the alternative doesn't exist, because this is what it means to be too valuable to be allowed to die. This is the Imperium's gift to its greatest warriors. Not death with honor, but life without end. Not rest, but eternal vigilance. Not peace, but the endless grinding violence of a war that will never conclude. They call it glory, they call it duty, they call it the Emperor's blessing. I call it what it is, the coldest form of damnation, dressed in ceremony and sacred oils, sustained by prayers to gods that do not answer, justified by necessities that serve only to perpetuate themselves. I am the Imperium's weapon, its symbol, its proof that service transcends the mortal span, and I will never, ever be allowed to rest.